The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night as a patrol officer pulls over a sleek black car on a quiet street. He steps out, hand hovering near his holster, ready to assert his authority. A routine traffic stop, or so he thinks. The driver, calm but firm, asks a simple question: "What's the reason for this stop, officer?" But something about the man's tone, his confidence, unsettles the cop. He doesn't back down. Instead, he doubles down, demanding ID, pushing for control. The tension thickens. The officer, certain he's dealing with just another difficult citizen, makes a decision he'll soon regret. He cuffs the man, ignoring his protests, his insistence that there's been a mistake. The radio crackles. Dispatch calls in. And that's when the officer's world tilts on its axis. The man he just detained? He's not just some stranger. He's the new police chief. And the officer? Well, his night just went from bad to worse. The officer's grip tightens around the cuffs as he hears the dispatcher's voice crackling through his radio. "Repeat that?" he says, suddenly feeling a cold weight settle in his gut. "You need to release him immediately," the dispatcher urges. But the words are drowned out by the hammering of his own pulse. The man in cuffs doesn't struggle, doesn't shout. He just watches, his gaze steady, unreadable. That confidence? Where does it come from? The officer swallows, his mouth dry, and finally looks at the ID he had dismissed earlier. The name stares back at him. A name he should have recognized. His stomach drops. "Chief?" he breathes, the word barely escaping his lips. The man gives him a long, measured look. "Yes, officer. Now, are you going to uncuff me, or should I call someone else to do it?" The officer fumbles with the key, hands suddenly unsteady. The cuffs snap open, but the damage is already done. The weight of his mistake settles like lead in his chest. The new chief rubs his wrists, his expression unreadable, but there's something in his eyes, disappointment maybe. Or something worse. The silence stretches between them. Then, finally, the chief speaks. "Follow me." Without another word, he turns and walks toward his car, leaving the officer standing frozen in place. There's no yelling, no threats, no instant consequences. But somehow, that makes it even worse. The officer hesitates, but he knows he doesn't have a choice. He follows. Inside the station, the weight of what happened grows heavier. The chief disappears into his office, and the officer is left in limbo. He doesn't know what's coming next. Suspension? Termination? Or something even worse, being left to stew in his own guilt, waiting for the hammer to drop. His partner, who had stayed behind in the patrol car during the incident, finally approaches. "Dude, what were you thinking?" "I didn't know," the officer mutters, rubbing his temples. "How was I supposed to know?" His partner shakes his head. "You didn't check the ID. You just assumed." The officer knows he's right. He had let his assumptions take control. The guy had seemed too confident, too self-assured, and instead of considering the possibility that he was dealing with someone important, he had seen it as a challenge. He had pushed too hard. And now he was facing the fallout. Meanwhile, inside his office, the new chief sits down, his expression serious as he processes what just happened. He had expected challenges stepping into this role, expected resistance even. But this? Getting detained by his own officer on his first night? That was something else entirely. He leans back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before reaching for the phone. "I need a full report on Officer Reynolds," he says. His voice is calm, measured, but his mind is already working through the implications of what happened. This wasn't just about one bad stop. It was about something bigger. A culture. A pattern. And if that was the case, he had a much bigger problem on his hands than one overzealous officer. The station's fluorescent lights buzz softly, filling the silence as the officer Reynolds waits outside the chief's office. The weight in his chest hasn't lifted. If anything, it's grown heavier, suffocating him in ways he hadn't expected. He keeps running through the night in his head, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything went wrong. But the truth is, it wasn't just one moment. It was a series of them small decisions, unchecked assumptions, a growing frustration that he had let spiral into something worse. His partner lingers nearby, arms crossed. "You think he's gonna fire you?" he asks. Reynolds exhales sharply. Wouldn't blame him if he did. His partner doesn't argue. And that, more than anything, makes his stomach turn. Inside the office, the chief stares at the report in front of him. Officer Reynolds' file isn't spotless, but it's not a disaster either. No major complaints, no serious infractions. Just a few minor warnings, a couple of questionable stops, but nothing that screamed misconduct. And yet, tonight had been different. The chief presses his fingers against his temples, exhaling slowly. The weight of what had happened wasn't just personal, it was systemic. If one of his own officers could pull rank on a stranger, without thinking twice, what did that say about the culture within his department? And what did it mean for the people they were supposed to serve? He picks up the phone and makes a call. "Get Reynolds in here." Seconds later, there's a hesitant knock at the door. "Come in." Reynolds steps inside, shoulders tense, jaw clenched. He doesn't sit. He doesn't speak. He just waits. The chief watches him carefully. Finally, he leans forward. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds, why did you stop me tonight?" Reynolds swallows. "Your car was moving slow. Looked suspicious." The chief raises an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" Reynolds shifts his weight. "It was late. We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area. So you assumed I was a suspect? I know who you were." "That's not what I asked." Reynolds clenches his jaw. Yeah. I assumed." The chief nods slowly, letting the admission hang between them. "And when I asked why you stopped me?" Reynolds looks down. "I got defensive." The chief doesn't respond right away. Instead, he lets the silence stretch, forcing Reynolds to sit with it. Then, finally, he speaks. "Do you know why that's a problem?" Reynolds hesitates, then exhales. "Because I didn't de-escalate." "Because you didn't even try." The words land hard. Reynolds feels something inside him twist, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to regret. "I messed up," he admits, voice quieter now. The chief watches him carefully. Yeah. "You did. Another silence. Then the chief leans back in his chair. "I should fire you." Reynolds' stomach drops. But the chief isn't done. "But I don't think that solves anything." Reynolds looks up, confused. "Firing you lets you walk away without having to fix what's broken," the chief continues. "And if I do that, someone else just like you will take your place." And nothing changes. Reynolds doesn't know what to say. He had walked in expecting consequences, maybe even hoped for them, in some way. But this was worse. The chief folds his hands on the desk. "I'm giving you a choice." Reynolds stiffens. "You can turn in your badge and walk out that door." His throat tightens. "Or you can stay. But if you do, things are going to be different." Reynolds swallows. "Different how?" "Training. Accountability. A hell of a lot of self-reflection." The chief's voice is firm. "You won't like it. It's going to be uncomfortable. And if I see even a hint of the same attitude you showed tonight, you're gone." Reynolds exhales slowly. The easy choice is right there walking away, starting fresh somewhere else. But deep down, he knows that won't fix anything. Not for himself. And not for the people he's supposed to serve. He looks at the chief. "I want to stay." The chief nods. "Then get ready to do the work." Weeks pass. The tension from that night doesn't disappear overnight, but it shifts. Reynolds is forced to take a hard look at his own actions, his instincts, the way he moves through his job. The chief follows through on his word mandating new training, new policies, new expectations. Some officers push back. Some don't think anything needs to change. But the chief doesn't waver. Slowly, things start to shift. Conversations happen that never happened before. Officers start questioning their own biases, their own assumptions. It's not perfect. Change never is. But it's something. Reynolds still feels the weight of that night. Maybe he always will. But instead of burying it, he carries it with him, letting it shape the officer he becomes. And the chief? He knows this is just the beginning. But as he watches his department start to change, really change, he allows himself a rare moment of hope.